you become what you practice, and if you withdraw and lie, you become a lying coward. That's what happens. You don't have to practice that much before that's the case. So is that what you want? Well, no one will come after me. It's yes, they will. Part of it is also really understanding in some way that there's no escape. There's no safe path. There's a noble path. There's an honorable path. There's no safe path. And possibly you wouldn't want that anyways, because, well, who are you exactly? Look at you, warrior stock. Every single one of your ancestors has stayed alive for 3.5 billion years. It's like, good work, man. That's a lot. And so, what makes you so sure you're built for safety? What makes you so sure that that's what we should strive for? And then if you want adventure, I'll tell you what an adventure is. You tell the truth as nearly as you can, and you'll have the adventure of your life. That's for sure.
What do you think schools should be doing to be able to help young men do better at this instead of falling behind at the race that they've been falling behind at today?
Well, I think a fair bit of it is going to have to do with a proper explanation about why they need to learn to write and read. And I also think that our schools, led by the faculties of education at universities, which is an enterprise that's become corrupted almost beyond belief. We should make much more of an effort to ensure that kids are unbelievably proficient readers. And a lot of that is going to involve early automatization of letter and phoneme and syllable and word recognition. So, because what happens is, when you teach a child to read, first of all, you teach them the alphabet and the sounds. And we have an alphabetic language, thank God, because it makes things much simpler. And so you teach them the letters, and then the 2-letter combinations, and then the 3-letter combinations. And then they can sound out syllables, and then they get words. But it isn't until you can read phrases automatically at a glance that you can read for content and pleasure. And so a lot of kids get stuck, especially if they don't come from particularly literate homes where all of this is sort of taught, maybe starting at, 12 months when they're first dragging a book around and becoming familiar with the book as an object, right, before they even learn to read. You got to get kids through that automatization phase, and that requires intense mass practice. And that's not that intrinsically interesting, right? But if you can get them to the point where they can read for content, well, then it starts to become interesting, just as interesting, let's say, as going to a movie or perhaps playing a video game. And so that has to be made an absolute priority. And if the faculties of education were doing their job, they would have produced technology to solve that problem for virtually every child, because it is only a matter of practice. Smarter kids will learn faster, but with enough practice, pretty much everybody is going to get there. So, and then there's the marketing issue. It's like, well, why should you read? Well, do you want to be stupid? Do you want to be stupid? What happens when you're stupid? You walk into walls because you don't see them. And if someone comes along who's more educated than you, more literate and cannier, you'll lose, man. You'll lose. And you'll lose too because you can't think properly. So you won't aim at the right things, and you won't be informed by the great individuals of the past. And you need that. We're historical creatures. This isn't optional. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Because you can't tell the truth, right? Because who are you to tell the truth? That's a mighty tall order, man. But you can stop saying things that you know are lies. And that will change your life if you do that. And it's crucial.
Why would it change their lives?
Well, how can you adapt to reality when you falsify it? And you think, well, I'm just lying to other people. No, you're not. You can't just lie to other people, because what you say becomes you, especially if you practice it. Because we build ourselves out of words. And that can be lies in action too. It's like, don't say things you know to be false. That's a good start, man. And it allies yourself with the truth. And how can that be a bad idea? Imagine that what is true reflects reality, which is sort of the definition of true. How can failing to align yourself with reality work? How is that possibly going to work? Well, you say, well, I can, if I lie, I get away with something. It's like, no, you don't. I tell you, I swear this is true. In all of my clinical practice, I have never, ever seen anyone ever get away with anything, even once. You think the chickens won't come home to roost. It's like, all that means is you're too stupid to see what your lies caused, or too blind or too self-deceptive. You just don't see it. And so you don't get away with anything. Nothing. It's terrifying to actually understand that. It's terrifying. What if you can't get away with anything, ever? Well, that's the judgmental God, fundamentally. That's a very old idea, and it's an old idea for a reason. And of course you can't get away with anything, because imagine that you took a flexible plastic comb, and you bent it backwards, and you say, well, I got away with that. It's like, well, what's going to happen when you let go? It's going to snap back and hit you in the face, and that's life, man. You warp the structure of reality? You think you are someone who can warp the structure of reality with your words and get away with it? Really? No, man, that should terrify you right to the core of your soul. You're not God. You can't do that.
So Dr. Peterson, you said that you've never seen someone get away with lying.
Anything.
What do you mean by that? Because I can imagine if somebody listening to this right now who said, well, I haven't told the truth and I got away with plenty of things in my past. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, everything is right in your life. Everything is just the way you want it to be. That's how it is it? Yeah, sure. And good. If find someone like that, great. But I've never seen anyone like that. And psychopaths, they have no conscience. They lie all the time. Well, how do they get away with it? They don't. They have to move. Because people figure out who they are, and then they have to move on. And so you could say, well, that's getting away with it. It's like, well, no long-term relationships, no love, no trust, no brotherly affection, no friends, and generally no financial success, not in the real sense. How is that getting away with it? And then you might say, well, I've got away with it so far. It's like, maybe you have. And maybe you're just too dim to see the consequences because you've blinded yourself, and God only knows who you could have been if you wouldn't have lied your way to where you are now. No, I've never seen it. And sometimes I'd work with someone to untangle what had happened to them over multiple years as things fell apart. And we'd find all sorts of lies, not always ones they told, but sometimes lies their parents told them, for example, that deep, dark, terrible things. Messing things up in an unbelievably catastrophic and tragic way. Now, it was absolutely terrifying. But I can't see how it just doesn't make sense. It's like, how could you possibly defend the idea that you could warp the structure of reality and get away with it? I mean, who, like I said, who do you think you are? Reality is, you don't mess with it. Like, it kills you. And it'll torture you quite a lot before doing that if you're particularly unlucky. So beware. They say the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. That's that judgmental God. It's like, you violate your conscience, man. You will pay. That's hell. There are times in your life where you know that the thing that you're saying is not true. It's a deception. It's a lie of some sort, and you're using it to manipulate yourself or another person or the world. And you're also fully possessed of the idea that you can get away with it. And there's a satanic arrogance about that. In fact, that is the archetypal arrogance that's portrayed in the mythological character of Satan, because Satan is precisely the archetype of the element of the mind that believes that it can twist and bend the structure of reality without paying the price for that. And you can't imagine anything that's more arrogant than that, because really, do you really think that you can twist the structure of a reality and that's going to work out for you without it snapping back? It's so obvious that can't work, that everyone knows it. But anyways, back to the initial point, is that by the rules of the game that you yourself are playing, that some of the times you're violating the rules of the game that you're playing. And the first issue with regards to, say, stating the truth or behaving in a responsible manner would be merely stop cheating at whatever game it is that you've chosen to play. That's a good start, and that'll straighten out your life.
We've met some of your fans, and we got the impression they were all male fans, the ones that we talked to, and that they were struggling with their manhood, and that you give them this message that it's okay to be a man.
It's not okay. It's necessary. What the hell are we going to do without men? You look around the city here, you see all these buildings go up, these men, they're doing impossible things. They're under the streets, working on the sewers, they're up on the power lines in the storms and the rain. They're keeping this impossible infrastructure functioning, this thing that works in a miraculous manner. They work themselves to death, and often literally, and the gratitude for that is sorely lacking, especially among the people who should be most grateful. You see university professors, especially of the social justice bent, who are among the most protected and privileged people that the world has ever produced. They take everything they have for granted, failing to understand entirely that there's a massive infrastructure of unbelievably hardworking, solidly laboring, working class men breaking themselves in half on a regular basis, making sure that everything that always breaks works. And so a little gratitude for that is in order. And it's very useful to tell everyone, not just men, that they have an important role to play, a necessary role, and that if they act properly and honestly and forthrightly, that they can put their lives together and they can help their families and they can make their communities better, and that's not toxic masculinity, that appalling phrase. It's what keeps the world going round. If we had any sense, we'd understand that, instead of doing everything at every possible moment to label what we have in the West as oppressive and patriarchal and fundamentally predicated on power, of all the insane propositions. My audiences are often composed mostly of men between, say, 20 and 35, not exactly young, but young enough. And they're desperate for a discussion about responsibility and fair play and noble being and working properly in the world, and the idea, and to hear the idea that their lives actually matter, that if they straighten themselves up and fly right, that they'll have a beneficial effect on themselves and their family and the community, and that the world is starving for that. And for them as individuals, not for them as a group, but for each of them as individuals. So yeah, it breaks me up. Every time the topic comes up, it breaks me up, because it's so damn sad, and we're so stupid. We're alienating young men. We're telling them that they're patriarchal oppressors and denizens of rape culture and you know, tyrants in waiting, and we fail to discriminate between their competence and their tyranny, and it's awful. It's so destructive. It's so unnecessary. And it's so sad. And so whenever I think about it, especially because of all that I've seen of it, it makes me sad, like deeply. It's so sad.
What has been your experience with dealing with these men who have these nice guy tendencies, who can't stand up for themselves, who their moms raised them to be this type of anti-man?
Yeah, well, sometimes that can also be temperamental, right? Because if a man happens to be high in agreeableness, this is also true of women. They're much more conflict averse, and they're nicer in their temperament. So if you get an agreeable boy, let's say, who also has a doting mother, then you might have that problem. There's other ways of having that problem, but that's one way. Well, when I saw people like that in therapy, they were often resentful and angry and passive aggressive and getting in their own way, often to spite, you know, whoever was doting on them, let's say. And so the first thing I would do is listen to why they were there, and then start to unpack that anger, and then start to work with the individual to figure out how to voice that. You know, you have to separate out what's old history and useless, and what's just narcissism and infantilism from genuine concerns. But if you listen to people, they will sort that out for themselves. That's one of the cool things about being a therapist, is if you listen, that happens more or less by itself. And then as a behavioral psychologist, you know, maybe someone like that would need a raise, but would be afraid to ask their boss. Well, we just practice that. It's like, okay, well, first of all, why should your boss give you a raise? Like, there might be good reasons. He doesn't want to lose you because you're a good worker. Well, are you a good worker? And if you weren't, well, we'd solve that problem. Put yourself in a position where you deserve the raise. Okay, well, now you're too timid or you're too unskilled, because you have to differentiate those two things too, because some people who can't stand up for themselves actually don't know how, whereas others are afraid, and some are both. And so you have to figure out, so some of it's skill training. Well, how do you actually ask your boss for a raise? Well, you tell the truth. That's the best way. You say, look, you know, here's what I'm doing, here's why it's really useful for you. It looks like I'm somewhat underpaid in this role. That's demotivating me, possibly. I also have other options. I think I need, 15% more, and I'm interested in moving up, and here's what I'll do for you if you do that. And so, think about it. And then if your boss doesn't do that and all that's true, well, then you should be assertive enough to find another job. Or maybe you look for another job before you even ask for the raise. Put your CV together, right? Update it so you're not afraid to look for another job. All this is strategic thinking. That was another thing that was really fun about clinical work. Most of my clients, they doubled or tripled their salaries within 3 or 4 years. Oh, wow. They worked at it. This wasn't nothing. This was major league strategic planning. And that was true for women and men, so, and that's very fun to watch that happen. Think clearly about it, right? And get your act together, and you got to see what's getting in your way. So maybe you're afraid to ask your boss for a raise because if he says no, you'd have to look for a job, and you don't have your resume or CV updated. And the reason you don't have it updated is because you're embarrassed about the lacks in it, and you don't want to face the lacks because then you'd have to see how you didn't get educated properly because you were useless, and you'd have to take steps to rectify that, and it's a real mess down there, right? Yeah. The reasons you're not asking. So we'd lay that all out and then say, well, you're embarrassed about your resume. Well, update it and let's take a look at it. Okay, well, here's some holes and they're not good. What could you do to fix those? And then you break it down into small steps, right? Implementable steps, because that's very practical. So that's a good thing to know. If you have your sights set on a goal, you'll move towards it if you break the steps down small enough so that even someone as useless as you will do it. And that also requires a fair bit of humility, because what you might find, especially if you're avoiding something, is that the step you are actually willing to take is so small that you're embarrassed to admit it to yourself, so you won't take any steps at all. Well, that's completely counterproductive. And the reason that's not proper thinking, let's say, or productive thinking, is that, well, small steps get bigger real fast, and it doesn't matter where you start. If you're doubling your utility every few weeks, who cares where you start? It starts to take off real quick. So you don't want to be embarrassed. You don't want to be so embarrassed by where you are that it stops you from becoming who you could be. And that's tough. It can be that's real tough. I'm not making light of that. I see exactly why people avoid, but it's not a good solution. Look, last night, I was at this talk I gave, and about 1,000 people came, and about 500 of them stayed afterwards, and most of them were young men, and just one of them after the other comes up to me, and they shake my hand, and they say, look, I've been listening to what you've been saying for 6 months, and it's changed my life. It's like I was depressed, I was addicted to drugs, my relationships weren't working out, I was hopeless, I didn't have any goal. I started cleaning up my room and telling the truth and working hard on myself, and it's really working, and I just want to thank you for helping me. And I think, God, it's so sad that so many of these men, they've not had an encouraging bloody word, a real encouraging word in their entire life. It just takes a little bit of of encouragement and care so that they're willing to set themselves straight to some degree and start trying. It's just a catastrophe that's so rare in their lives. You have to particularize your problem. Why can't men find women to date? That's not your problem. Your problem is why you can't find the woman you want. Yeah. And you have to assume that's your problem, because otherwise you have to assume that it's the women's problem. And really? They're all wrong and you're right. Really? Lucky you. Maybe you are. You're an undiscovered gem of some sort. Probably not. Be a little stronger, dress a little better, speak a little more clearly, aim a little higher, and practice that, and that'll work. Now, I know that that's more difficult for some people than others, because some people bear incredibly difficult developmental burdens, and I'm not saying that this is easy, but I'm saying that it's a useful reaction. What else are you going to do? What else are you going to do? Complain about women? I've seen that in men. I went out with a group of men who were having trouble with their wives, and they'd gone off to this couples retreat, and it was mostly rubbish, although they were trying a bit to get their lives together. And I spent a whole day with them. There were 3 of them, and one of them was a guy that I'd known for quite a while, and every single word he said was a lie. And all these 3 did the whole day was complain about their wives. And I thought, what the hell's wrong with you guys? You picked them. They're these women you picked, and maybe they have their flaws, but they're your wives. And that's how you talk about them? And you think they're the problem? You're so dumb that you don't even know that you shouldn't badmouth your wife. Just because she's your wife. When Tammy and I got married, we had a discussion about that. It's she has her flaws and I have my flaws, but I'm her husband and she's my wife, and there's a certain respect that goes along with that category, if you have any sense. And so that's an extension of the same thing. It's best to look to yourself. Now and then you can, things have gone rotten in society, and you have to bear your responsibility. You have to address that at a social level and a communal level, but fundamentally it's and you do so much less harm if you look to yourself first as the problem. And believe me, you're plenty of problem for you. You're all the problem you need for you. That's for sure. I would say to young men who are irritated at women is, if you're irritated at women, as a class of creature, there's something wrong with you, because they're right. You're wrong. They're right to not pick you. If they're not picking you, it's because they're right.
Wow.
Now, that might I know that's a terrible thing to say, and I know perfectly well, it wasn't like I was particularly successful with girls when I was young. So I know what that rejection is like. I know what that fear is like. I don't know it as well as some men know it, because I wasn't rejected outright. But what you have to understand is that, what do you expect from women? If you got pregnant because you had sex, you'd be pretty damn choosy too. So, clue in a bit. And then, well, don't they find you attractive? Well, maybe you're not. Have you paid attention to how you dress? Do you have a plan? Are you as educated as you could be? Are you a liar? Are you a rabid pornography user? Because maybe that's undermining your motivation to seek out a woman and grow yourself up. It's if you're rejected constantly and you're out there really trying, because that's another thing to ask yourself is, well, how many women have you actually asked out? And are you so sure that you're not picking women who will certainly reject you because you're trying to bat out of your league? Because you might be. So, and I'm speaking about this as a clinician too, because I had plenty of men in my practice who were, radically unsuccessful with women. I had one man in particular. He was so afraid of women he couldn't use the phone. He was too afraid of everyone to use the phone. And he had been bullied like mad, and he had his problems. So I know what this is like, but pornography is a big problem. It's a big problem. It's a real curse, that pornography, in my opinion, because it's an easy out. And so we don't know what the consequences of that are. We're starting to understand some of them. But if you were better, you'd be more successful with women. So you have to have that in your mind. And you cannot be angry at women. It's stupid. Women, it's like women being angry at men. It's a sign of psychological trouble, that. Women have a tendency to prefer bad men higher in dark triad traits. How come the Bible describes a mode of being as associated with nice guy traits which contradict that? Okay, well, I take issue with both elements of that, actually. I don't believe that women do have a tendency to prefer bad men higher in dark triad traits. They may have a tendency to be more erotically attracted to men who are capable of manifesting dominance and aggression. I think the evidence for that is relatively clear, and I don't think the Bible at all describes a mode of being as associated with nice guy traits. I don't know, that may be how it's classically taught, for example, because Christ is often presented, especially in more simple-minded variants, and I'm not being pejorative about that precisely, as the ultimate in nice guys, but I don't think that that's true at all. That's a reasonable characterization at all if you read the gospel accounts, because he was someone who was certainly capable of saying very, very harsh things to people, and was also identified very strongly as a figure who was capable of using judgment and distinguishing between what was positive and what was negative, and that capacity for judgment is something quite different than the mere nice guy compassion that would be associated with high levels of trait agreeableness. So I think that the idea that the ideal that's put forward in the biblical writings is something like be harmless, I think that's a real misreading of the text, and I also think that it's wrong, because harmless and good are not the same thing at all. And in fact, I think one of the best ways of characterizing like a higher order morality, and this is something that Nietzsche talked about a fair bit, is that, and Jung as well, with regards to the idea of integration of the shadow, is that someone who's moral has the capability for violence and the capability for aggression built in and at hand, but is also someone who's perfectly capable of controlling that in a civilized manner. And I think that, I'm speaking off the cuff here, obviously, but I think that the attraction that some women have for the sort of men who are more likely to misbehave, to act in a delinquent manner and so forth, is partly their desire to be associated with men who have the capacity for aggression. Now, the best of all possible worlds is when that capacity for aggression is civilized and held under control. But so I would say that one of the things that men should do as they mature is transform themselves into monsters, but also become civilized at the same time. And that's exactly what you see in stories like Beauty and the Beast, where the ideal man starts out as a beast and ends up civilized. He doesn't start out as a milksop, wimp sort of character who poses no threat to anyone and then becomes the hero. That isn't how it works, although there are stories of that kind of development.
What advice do you have for a young man in his 20s?
Make a plan. Look at what you're interested in. Get disciplined about something. Allow for the possibility that you have something important to contribute to the world, and that the world would be a lesser place without that contribution. Don't be afraid of taking on responsibility. It's where you find what sustains you in your life. You can take on too much responsibility. You have to be cautious in that regard, but that's a less common problem than not taking on enough. A lot of the things that people regard as traps are actually the means to their life. Often young people are afraid of commitment, for example, in the context of a romantic relationship, and because they feel that that's going to interfere with their pursuit of something more valuable. But that's just not the case. You're not going to find something more valuable in your life than a committed relationship with someone that you love, that sustains itself across time, and that in all likelihood produces children. That's life. And there may be people for whom avoiding that is the better route, but those people are very rare, and you need a real reason to assume that you're one of those people. And hopefully for you, you're not. You know, I've had a very good career, a very meaningful career in multiple dimensions, and it's still been the case for me that the most important part of my life has been my intimate relationship with my wife and my family. It doesn't look to me like pornography is really a very good idea. I don't think it's helping anyone. Now, you know, there might be codicils to that, freedom of expression, some potential educational utility, the pleasure that's a consequence of sexual utilization of pornographic material. But I would still say, seeing all that it's not a net social good. It doesn't do the people who produce it or who consume it any good. And I don't believe that anyone feels like a better human being after utilizing pornography for sexual gratification. Now, you might say, well, that's because they've been shamed about sex since they're born, and, you know, and that's a consequence of our crooked culture. And, you know, in a utopian world, we wouldn't have that shame. And yeah, no. It's way more complicated than that. And I read something in one of the YouTube comments in my video the other day. I was talking to Abigail Schreier about the apparent fact that today's teenagers are having much less sex. One person commented that there's the shame that men feel when sex is a spectator sport rather than a participatory act. And then you think, well, you know, the mere fact that you're watching two other people, one of whom isn't you, having sex instead of having sex, really implies something either about it implies something about your desirability. It's pretty hard to shake that, isn't it? Or your courage. Why is it that you're sitting there alone at night with your laptop on your lap? What the hell's wrong with you? Well, nothing. It's just we should dispense with sexual shame. It's like, no, probably not. That's probably not the answer.
Effect of free and widely available pornography is having on young people, especially men in our society at this time?
Well, I think it's like Treasure Island in Pinocchio. It's all pleasure with no responsibility. That's deadening. It's parasitical in a sense. And I don't mean that, I'm not making a value judgment. I mean, it's no wonder the young guys are caught up in this, because it's an unbelievably powerful technology. It drove the development of the internet, let's not forget, right? So it taps into one viciously primordial motivation. And so these guys are being blasted by what biologists call superstimuli all the time. So imagine that there's a biological stimulus that has an effect on you, and then you can magnify it. And the typical porn actress, not the amateurs, but the professionals, have their sexually provocative physical elements exaggerated. And so men are very visual in terms of their sexual processing. And so, you know, the guys are pulled into it, and they're pulled into it also by curiosity. But I think that ethically it's not good. It's not good. It's an easy out. That's the other thing, you know, is what you should be doing is going out and finding someone to have a relationship with. And if you can gratify yourself with no transformation, but let's say you can't find someone, well, then you might say that's an indication you should change. It is, in fact, an indication that you should change, because what better indication are you going to get than that no one wants to be intimate with you? It's the ultimate rejection, and that's partly why men are terrified of it, and I understand that. And I also understand the MGTOW guys, you know, who are just recommending that men don't enter into long-term permanent relationships with women. I understand where they're coming from, although I called them pathetic weasels a while back. I shouldn't have done that. Well, they're providing a lot of young guys who need a kick to go out there.
Right, they're actually giving them the back door.
They're giving them a rationale, yeah, and I've seen this have very detrimental effects on a number of people already, and partly in my clinical practice, because these guys, the young guys who aren't successful, they're looking for a reason why women are terrible, because otherwise they have to think, well, they're just not presentable, which is what they do have to think, because that's almost the definition of presentable, right? So, and then the MGTOW guys give them a rationale. You know, we are in a gynocentric world and females have got control and they'll like wipe you out if they have the opportunity. It's like, well, some females will do that to some guys some of the time. So I think it's reasonable to assume that there's a novelty edge in pornography, like there is in so many quasi-addictive phenomenon. And so it has to become, because novelty is a sexual kick, it has to stay novel, and that means that over time it's going to become more extreme. So that's not good. Well, so how do you resensitize yourself in some sense? Well, you stop. You stop. And then hopefully you recover. And then you deprive yourself of that outlet, let's say. And you might say, well, you know, is that absolutely necessary? And maybe there's nothing wrong with pornography. It's like, well, I don't know, man. Like, have you ever really met a guy who is proud of that? Like, you know what I mean? That makes him feel like, I'm the guy, man. You know, I'm watching pornography and getting off. It's like, what a man. I don't believe anyone feels that. And to me, maybe I'm wrong. And to me, that's an indication that, yeah, we know. No, it's pretty cheap. It's cheap. It's easy. And, you know, I say that knowing that I believe the research evidence shows that if you introduce pornography into a community, that rates of sexual crime committed by men upon women actually decline. So there is perhaps some utility in the outlet. But, you know, that's a unidimensional analysis and doesn't take into account all the other effects of pornography. So, including the ones you described, and I think that those are real. It makes sense that they're real, you know, because it's super satiation. And it's a non-trivial technological problem, you know. It's now possible for young men to look at more beautiful nude women in one day than any man has ever seen, you know, prior to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, than any man in history had ever seen. That's not nothing. That's something. And to think that doesn't do anything to you, it's like, no, that likely does something to you. So don't substitute the false for the real. And don't underestimate the utility of deprivation. You know, what do we need to drive us forward to have the adventure of our life? You know, well, some deprivation, that's for sure. That heightens desire and drive, and maybe you need that. You're afraid to approach a woman. Well, you remove part of your drive with pornography, and so now you don't have that sexual urge to overcome that anxiety, and so you stay timid for your entire life. You know, maybe not, but maybe. They don't have a value hierarchy. So Pleasure Island, it's a good example. Those kids that were brought there were lost. So they didn't have anywhere to go. They didn't have an identity. So they default to local pleasure. And that's better than none. Although the problem with local pleasure, well, as the narrative made clear, is that you better look out if you're impulsive, because it's going to kick back on you hard. And the reason is, you're only considering the immediate time frame. And the problem is that things propagate across all the time frames. And so just because something works really well this second, cocaine, for example, doesn't mean that it's a tenable solution to the class of all problems. So usually, often, people pursue local pleasure because that's the best they can imagine. It's the best they've been taught. They don't see another alternative. So it can be ignorance. It can be they don't want to adopt the responsibility, because part of the problem with working at every level of the hierarchy simultaneously is that it's Well, it's like dancing to a very complex waltz, let's say. You have to be paying attention to a very large number of things simultaneously and doing things right. It requires responsibility. And so, you know, it's a pain. It's a weight. Part of the reason people drink alcohol is to get rid of their responsibility. I mean, that's, you know, you hear people drink because they have problems. It's like, yeah, no. Some people drink because they're anxious, and alcoholics drink because they're in withdrawal. But young people drink because they're sick and tired of being responsible, because it's annoying. It's like, so I'll drink enough, I won't care about the medium to long-term consequences, because alcohol, that's exactly what alcohol does. It doesn't make you ignorant of the medium to long-term consequences, but it makes you not care about them. And partly it's because it dampens anxiety. So it dampens anxiety, it leaves your positive emotion circuits intact, so then you can go out there and do stupid fun things, and that's a party, really. Let's go do stupid fun things. That's a party. But the medium to long-term consequences it's risky. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but it's risky. So, yeah, they don't know better. That's the answer, I would say.